North Sentinel Island is home to an isolated tribe located in the Bay of Bengal, known as the North Sentinelese. It's located only about 20 miles from the Andaman Islands, and only about 50 to 400 people are still believed to be inhabiting the island. This ancient island holds one of the most isolated and primitive tribes still on Earth. This is North Sentinel Island, a complete timeline. So it's believed that roughly 70,000 years ago, modern humans began migrating out of East Africa, likely due to environmental pressures and resource scarcity. This group is believed to be part of the first wave of Homo sapiens to enter Southeast Asia. And by the time they reached the Andaman Islands, sea levels were much lower due to the Ice Age, making island access much easier as it was exposed as dry land. They most likely walked onto North Sentinel Island, and as far as we know, they've remained there isolated for thousands of years. Though they likely share roots with other Negrito populations across Southeast Asia, the Sentinelese diverged early, remaining culturally and genetically distinct due to extreme isolation. Genetic studies show that the Andamanese, and particularly with the Onge, the Jarwa, and likely the Sentinelese, shared ancient ancestry with early coastal migrants. Genetic and archaeological evidence suggests that the ancestors of the Andaman Islands, including the Sentinelese, were part of this wave, and may have reached the Bay of Bengal region between 50 and 60,000 years ago. The first documented colonial encounter occurred in August of 1867, when the Indian merchant ship Nineveh ran aground on a reef near North Sentinel Island. All 106 crew members made it to shore in lifeboats and camped on the beach, but within days, they would be attacked by the Sentinelese warriors who were armed with spears and arrows. But fortunately for them, they would be saved by the British Royal Navy after several days. With the captain later writing, "The savages were perfectly naked, with short hair and red paint and noses. Their arrows appear to be tipped with iron." This would be the first recording of the Sentinelese having iron tools, and it predated the MV Primrose shipwreck that was famously left on the island in 1981 by over 100 years. This would then lead British naval officer Maurice Vidal Portman, then serving as the colonial administrator of the Andaman Islands, to the first official expedition to North Sentinel Island in January of 1880. Portman's group would land on the island and would then search for the North Sentinelese, and after several days they would come across an abandoned camp where they would capture 6 Sentinelese people, an elderly couple and 4 children. They would then be taken to Port Blair for research purposes by the anthropologists, but the elderly couple would soon fall ill and end up dying, leaving only the 4 children left. And after anthropologists realized that the North Sentinelese had been introduced to foreign illnesses that they had simply never come in contact with before, they would have to return the children back to the island, and they would litter them with gifts like coconuts and clothes. This is a direct quote from Portman in 1884. "They were terrified and completely unwilling to be approached. They made no attempt to communicate." This would be a sure reason for the North Sentinelese to be continually hostile towards any outsiders who try and approach them or the island. Despite the British maintaining control over the Andamans until about 1947, no long-term colonial occupation or missions were established on North Sentinel Island, but they did make several observations in the late 1800s. The island would then remain largely untouched, with no recorded conversions, colonizations, or resettlement attempts. Then in 1956, 2 Indian fishermen would illegally enter the restricted waters of North Sentinel Island, and the next morning they were reportedly killed by the Sentinelese, and their bodies were spotted buried in shallow graves on the beach. In response to this and similar incidents, the Indian government would then pass strict regulations. In 1956, India would then enact the Andaman and Nicobar Islands Protection of Aboriginal Tribes Regulation Act, which prohibited travel within 3 nautical miles. This regulation would ban photography, video recording, and contact with the Sentinelese without government approval. These rules would be put in place to protect the tribe from disease, cultural disruption, and potentially violent encounters. And beginning in 1967, Indian anthropologist T.N. Pandit would lead a series of expeditions to North Sentinel Island. This was under the Anthropological Survey of India, and they hoped to establish friendly contact with the Sentinelese. And over the next 30 years, Pandit and his team returned more than 24 times, documenting one of the most carefully monitored attempts to connect with an uncontacted tribe. And in 1967, the first major expedition would then be led by Pandit. The team landed on the western coast of the island and left gifts like coconuts, metal pots, cloths, and tools. And they noticed that the Sentinelese would observe from a tree line, but they did not engage. Then later in 1974, during a visit coordinated with National Geographic for a documentary, Man in Search of Man, which is where this footage came from, a crew member would be struck in the thigh by an arrow, and the team would quickly leave, but leave gifts. Tian Pandit would return to the island several more times throughout the 1970s and 80s, with some being relatively peaceful and other visits being met with massive aggression. And on August 2nd, 1981, the MV Primrose, which was a 3,000-ton freighter and registered in Hong Kong, ran aground on a reef just off of North Sentinel Island during a storm. The vessel was en route from Bangladesh to Australia carrying cargo of chicken feed. And over the next few days, the stranded crew made up of mostly Chinese and Burmese sailors noticed groups of Sentinelese assembling on the beach with bows, spears, and arrows. They would begin building canoes, signaling for a possible approach. And the crew, fearing for their lives naturally, sent out emergency radio messages requesting for weapons and military support. A distress call from the ship would read, "Wild men, estimated more than 50 of them, carrying various homemade weapons, are making 2 or 3 wooden boats. We're worried that they will board us at sunset." But fortunately for them, a storm would save them from the islanders, as they were never able to actually reach the ship. And after nearly a week of tension, a rescue operation by the Indian naval helicopters would successfully evacuate all crew members without conflict. And in the early 1990s, salvage teams were permitted by the Indian government to dismantle the ship. And according to a 2001 field report, workers reported regular visits by the Sentinelese, who accepted food offerings, mainly bananas, in exchange for peace, with one report noting, they came 2 to 3 times a month, watching from the beach or paddling out in dugouts. They showed interest in metal, but stayed at a cautious distance. And while it's not fully documented with how much metal the Sentinelese had uncovered, later sightings showed them with arrows tipped with metal, likely scavenged from the shipwreck. And this incident would mark the tribe's second known contact with modern materials, particularly with iron and steel. And today, the remains of the MV Primrose are believed to be mostly underwater and rusted away, but the incident remains one of the most well-documented close encounters with the Sentinelese in modern history. And in 1991, Indian anthropologist Dr. Madhumala Chattopadhyay became one of the first outsiders to have a peaceful encounter with the Sentinelese. She joined a government expedition alongside Tian Pandit and brought some coconuts for gifts. She would say, "The Sentinelese waded into the water and took coconuts directly from our hands. And unlike past visits, the tribe showed no aggression with no arrows and no threats." She believes that her presence may have made the group appear less threatening, hence the reason they came forward, and many photos were taken. A second visit days later also had a similar outcome. She later supported ending all future contact and warned outsiders that disease could wipe them out. But in 1991, a major breakthrough would happen. Tian Pandit and his team would approach North Sentinel Island's coast and dropped coconuts into the water like usual. But to their surprise, the Sentinelese would wade into the sea, with some being armed and some being unarmed, and accepted the coconuts directly from the crew. This would mark the most peaceful contact ever recorded between outsiders and the North Sentinelese. And although this was a remarkable interaction, it would soon come to a close. And in 1997, after several more visits, with some being peaceful and others being tense, the Indian government would begin to question the ethics, risks of continued contact, and Tian Pandit would then be forced into a retirement. This would mark the final expedition led by Tian Pandit. And in 2004, a tsunami would hit North Sentinel Island, with the Indian government sending helicopters out to survey the area and to see if any of them survived. And to their surprise, they were still there and they were fine. They most likely saw the signs of an incoming tsunami and fled inland to higher ground. This is a photo taken from the helicopter that actually went to take the survey on the island, showing a Sentinelese man aiming his bow at the helicopter, obviously displeased by its presence. And in November 2018, John Allen Chau, a 26-year-old American missionary and adventurer traveler, was killed after attempting to make contact with the Sentinelese. He would pay local fishermen in Port Blair of the Andaman Islands to illegally transport him by boat near North Sentinel Island. He'd be about a mile away and would then kayak alone to the shore, attempting contact by yelling "Jesus loves you" and offering gifts. The Sentinelese would return with shooting arrows at him, one piercing his Bible, and he then retreated. But the next day on November 15th, he would return despite the warnings. Witnesses reported the Sentinelese being hostile again, and he swam back to the boat after losing his kayak. Chau documented the events in his handwritten journal, aware that he might not survive. And on his third attempt, the fishermen left him near the shore. From a distance, they later saw tribesmen dragging his body along the beach. Chau was presumed dead. His body would never be recovered, as Indian officials refused to send in retrieval teams to avoid endangering both the Sentinelese and the rescue personnel. Many years later, on March 19, 2025, a 24-year-old American YouTuber known as Mikhailo Polyakov, landed illegally on North Sentinel Island using an inflatable boat. He then spent about 5 minutes on the beach and left some offerings. He left a coconut, a can of Diet Coke, and then collected some sand samples and filmed the solo excursion, although it's not thought to be posted online. Polyakov had previously attempted incursions in October of 2024 and January 2025, and in March of 2025 after landing, he was promptly arrested. The North Sentinelese are complex human beings, and as you can see with these many encounters with the outside world, it's not always the same story. Sometimes they're more forgiving, and other times it's done without a moment's notice. And although we find the North Sentinelese so fascinating, I think it's incredibly important to point out that nobody should go to the island under any circumstances. I'm going to be covering certain parts of these stories a little more in depth in other videos, so if you'd like to stay tuned, subscribe, and check me out for more videos. As always, I appreciate you guys for watching these. If you have any suggestions, leave them in the comments, and I'll see you guys in the next one.